From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There's increasing interest in using solitary bees in the pollination of major agricultural crops here in the western United States. In some ways, this has been going on for a very long time. Recall an earlier episode with Weldon Hobbs and Jim Kane as well with the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. But more recently, it has seen the increased use of blue orchard bees. And to get a better picture of what is the status of these solitary bees in Western agricultural crop pollination, but also what are some of the kind of horizons and challenges with increasing their use, I reached out, finally, I've been trying to get her on the show for a while, to Dr. Theresa Pitts-Singer. Now, Dr. Pitts-Singer is a research entomologist at the USDA ARS Pollinating Insect Research Unit, known as the Bee Lab in Logan, Utah. She's had over 18 years of experience and research into alfalfa leaf-cutting bees and blue orchard bees. And so I thought she'd be an excellent person to sort of address the broader picture of these solitary bees and where they are right now and what we might expect from them. And Dr. Pitts-Singer is going to be talking about a lot of these issues at an event this week, March 10th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the Pollinator Report Seasonal Bees at Your Service webinar series. I'm going to have the link in the show notes so you can check it out. It's going to have everything that we're going to talk about today, but with some beautiful pictures, so don't miss it. And without further ado, let's dive deep into the world of solitary bees and agricultural crop pollination in the West this week with Dr. Pitts-Singer. All right. Well, I'm so glad to have you on the show finally. I've been angling. I think I even chased you at an Orchard Bee Association meeting with a mic and you ran away, but I finally pinned you down.
Yeah. Sorry. I don't even run that fast.
Well, welcome finally to Pollination. And I guess we were talking a little bit about this show, and I think really want to talk about solitary bees and their role in agriculture. And to begin with, can you go through some of the managed solitary bee species that are available to growers in the West, and what crops have they been used historically to pollinate?
Sure. I would say the most famous solitary bee that's used as a crop pollinator is the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. That is a non-native bee that got introduced in the U.S. kind of at the ports of entry in I want to say the late 1930s, early 40s. That's when they found it in museum collections. And and then people like in the 50s up in Canada and around here in Utah and Oregon, Washington area saw that it was kind of in the alfalfa fields, but they didn't realize what a good pollinator it was until, they started to really look into it. And what they realized out in the West where it's nice and dry and alfalfa grows really well and you can stress a crop of alfalfa so that it puts out a lot of flower and sets a lot of seeds, that when these bees visited the flowers, they trip the flower, which kind of pops it open and releases the staminal column, which is the place where the pollen is. And so the pollen is released. They stick their heads down into the flower to get nectar and wiggle around a lot and collect the pollen. They were 3 times better at pollinating or transferring pollen between the flowers and even within the flower itself, just popping it open, tripping it, than honeybees. And so people had been bringing honeybees into alfalfa to pollinate it, but we're like, wow, this other little bee does such a good job. What is it? Where does it come from? How can we get it to stick around? And that's when kind of the research all started back in the 50s in Canada. I think Hobbs, I think you had Weldon Hobbs on. I think his dad was one of the pioneers of all of that. And then Bill Stephen he was in Oregon.
Yeah,
right? And then
yeah.
and then Dan Mayer, I think, who's in Washington. They were all kind of the major players. And then Ned Bohart in Utah, which was, it had a different name, but the Bee Lab where I am now is where he kind of started with all that. And so it's been around for quite some time, and it's a whole industry has developed around it. And the major source of the bees is from Canada, where they raise bees really well. Like they can get 3 times so you put out X number of bees and they get in Canada about 3 times back. In the US, we get about half as many back because we farm so intensively for the seed production versus the bee production. And so they're more likely to use pesticides, or just, we have a lot of disease and parasites and stuff in the U.S. too. So it's a one-way traffic from Canada into the U.S. for getting those bees. But that's been going on for a long time. And that's what my job was when I first came to Utah, was specifically to work on that bee.
It is surprising to me because, the last decade, there's been a lot of attention in crop pollination, and I haven't heard a peep. It has not made the New York Times. The alfalfa leaf cutting bee is out there doing this job, but it's a huge pollination event in the United States.
It is, and it's magnificent at its job. And, in a way, probably the reason we haven't heard from it is because it doesn't, it hasn't had the crisis that the honeybee has. It doesn't have varroa mites, and it doesn't have the colony collapse or the pesticide that's stored in the waxes and stuff. So it's kind of like it, because probably it is kind of saddled with the one crop and a specific use. And the farmers also know that it's so valuable for setting their crop and making their crop profitable that they take really good care of it. And a lot of the farmers are also bee managers. So they don't call in the honeybee people to drop off some hives. They do a lot of the management themselves. And so I think it's just a different attitude about having the bees there on their farm. And but they haven't really had a shortage of them. The price has gone up from when I first started working at the Bee Lab. The bees were, say, $15 to $25 for every 10,000 live bee cells, which is what's called a bee gallon. And now the price jumped to like 125 at some point, and maybe it's down to maybe 55 right now. So it just kind of waxes and wanes with the need for seed production from the proprietary seed companies, and also how good the weather was in Canada and the supply of bees are. So all those things factor into the economics of the price of bees. And sometimes the contracted seed production reflects that high dollar amount for the pollinators, and sometimes it doesn't. It's always kind of just with anything in the economy, there's always like somebody's mad at somebody else because the price of whatever is different this year. But it's kind of an interesting thing to learn about and to understand. And I find it fascinating. And it also, helps me understand why my job's important for having to figure out a ways for American farmers to do a better job at raising their own bees. The more bees they get back, the less they have to buy to supplement in the next year, because the bees are only around for a little while. They're not around year round like honeybees are. And so they're kind of a one-shot deal.
Okay. And so you've done a lot of research on working out the emerging problems on alfalfa leaf cutting bees, but you've also worked on other solitary bee species. Tell us a little bit about the other actors in this Western bee pollination.
Sure. The other bee that I know, because I don't know bees in general, but the other bee I know very well is the blue orchard bee, which is Osmia lignaria. It's a native bee species, and its prowess as a pollinator was probably figured out in the 70s. Some of the papers started to come out, and that was a bee that people at the Bee Lab noticed were great pollinators in like apple orchards locally. And then they realized that it's an early spring bee. It overwinters as an adult. It's a solitary bee, cavity nester. It's just it's a bigger bee, and it has some different qualities which have been interesting to figure out from the leaf cutting bee. But it's kind of the same. It's the same family of bees. But it comes out in the early spring with the orchard flowers, and pollinates only for about 6 weeks, and the adults are gone after that. It can be too hot for them for sure. And we don't have like an easy supply of them from Canada. A lot of people are getting them from trapping them in the wildlands where they exist freely, and then they bring them onto farms and try to propagate them on farms, and that never works out as well as anybody hopes. So they're always kind of retrapping them from the wildlands. So one of the main things we've been working on with that species is increasing their retention on farm and production on farm, plus trying to figure out other ways to raise them besides trapping them from the wildlands, and understanding where, if there's local adaptation to these bees, where if you wanted to use them in California almonds, which they're great in, can you source them from Utah and Washington without consequence? And the answer is no. So how do you manage them so that you can keep them in California and use them there and not have them, most of them die before the next year?
All right. Well, we'll come back to challenges, because I imagine with this is a very different model than beekeeping, and it has all sorts of, each species seems to have its own kind of problems.
Yeah,
challenges.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, some are the same, but then they're unique in their own ways, which is fun. Yeah.
But with blue orchard bees, you talked originally. People started to notice it in northern Utah on apples, but where is it primarily used these days?
It's not used much in Utah. It is primarily being used, and recently so, in almonds in California, and somewhat in cherries in California, and so I hear in cherries in Washington and maybe Oregon. I know my team has a research project. We're on year 3, kind of introducing the system to people in Washington who are kind of some big players in cherry production. And we're trying to show them that you can produce these bees in cherries, and maybe, we are showing that you can enhance fruit set, but we have not yet shown that you can increase fruit yield, because these people are still using their full complement of honeybees. But what they're learning is that these bees work in the cherries and work well in the cherries, and maybe it offers them a little bit of comfort in knowing there's another bee that can be a pollinator in those cherries. And so, what's the interesting is the difference between Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bees, and the Megachila retinata, the leaf cutting bees, is that when you add leaf cutting bees to alfalfa, it's way better than using honeybees, like 3 times the seed yield you get by using the leaf cutting bees. With the blue orchard bees, it's just an either or situation. The honeybees do fine, but if you have orchard bees instead, that does fine too. If you have orchard bees, half and half orchard bees and honeybees, you may have an increase because of some interaction that we don't quite understand yet. And that increase is usually in fruit set and not always fruit yield. So if we are, for a crop like cherries and almonds, where you could set fruit from every flower, as opposed to apples, where you might have to, if you want big fruit, you got to get rid of some of the flowers, so you don't need to set fruit on all of it. But if you could maybe manage the orchards to hold on to all that fruit throughout the whole season, so that it's a completely ripe, mature fruit or nut at the end of the summer, then you've increased your yield. What happens is you get more fruit set in the spring, so more of the flowers are turning into fruit in the springtime. But around June or so, in almonds especially, the nuts drop because the trees can't handle them. So you lose that rich pollination you got in the springtime. It's not carried over into yield in late summer, because around May or June, a lot of that fruit drops off the tree and doesn't mature, and it's not available as yield.
That's remarkable. I remember somewhere I read a study where they would look at the leaves after a heavy fruit set, and they would change, they drop their leaves quicker, or something. Like, there is a lot of stress on a plant to carry a huge crop. And so I guess what you're saying is that if I just recount this, people are seeing these benefits that may not necessarily be in yield when they're combining the 2 bees. So there seems to be this kind of like magic that happens when 2 bees are around, which I want to ask you about. But it doesn't. What people are not maybe realizing those benefits, because they're getting this kind of super abundant pollination, and so the trees aren't just, people haven't figured out, I guess, nutrition management for those trees. It's like you maybe need to give them a little bit more juice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and one horticulturist that I did ask about this very thing, because there's a lot of variation between orchards that we've worked in across areas, and then year to year they change so much. It's like one was good in one year and one's not the next, and I was like, they're like, it's not even on a schedule. It's not even every other year. It's some years it does and some years it doesn't. But what they said was, if you have spring come on so fast, especially in Southern California, the trees just can't handle it. But if you have a gradual turn on of spring to summer, if summer comes on too fast, not spring, but if you have that nice transition from spring to summer instead of instant summer, you can carry more of the fruit. But also you think about California, the water stress, that alone has got to play into that. And there's probably some company trade-offs on knowing that they've got all these acres, they only have so much water, and there's they're regulated how much water they can use. They already know they're going to lose some crop, but they have it balanced out for the economics to work out for them, which is some formulation that I don't know. But that probably plays into why they don't, you say, well, why don't you water more? Why don't you do more? It's like, well, maybe it's not economically in their favor to do it, these days.
Okay. So moving away from the plant management, because clearly there's a way in which, and I was thinking about this, we had a episode quite a while ago with in blueberry and bringing stocking rate of honeybees up high, and suddenly, this kind of maybe changes things. People have been adjusting nutrient management or water management to 2 colonies per acre or 4 colonies per acre, and suddenly you double it, and you may not see those the full benefits under the old settings. But I wanted to come back because I think, one of the things I often think about when it comes to mason bees or blue orchard bees, you see these little memes. It's like, one honeybee's, 40, no, there's like 40 honeybees is worth one honeybee. But I think what you're saying is the way in which this is actually coming about in agriculture is not replacing honeybees with blue orchard bees, but there's this a kind of refocusing on how you might pull these 2 bees together in this kind of magical thing that happens. Well, not magical, it's very biological. We just don't know what it is, that these 2 bees are working together. Tell us a little bit about that 2 bees and why 2 bees might be a better strategy than 1 bee.
Sure. Well, we all love diversity, right?
That's right.
Maybe that's just part of it, right? But no, so I have a pretty slide I like to use where I have a honeybee visiting a flower and a orchard bee visiting a flower. And the honeybee, you'll see, putting her face very carefully into a flower, into the goodies. And she's, honeybees are also very specific whether or not they're collecting just honey or just nectar or just pollen. But this particular picture has a bee that looks like she's collecting some nectar at the base of the flower, and her hind legs are packed with pollen. So that pollen is nowhere near the ovule or the stigma that it needs to touch in order to deliver that pollen to where it needs to go so it can fertilize the ovaries.
Oh, because a honeybee is really trying to move that pollen off her body as quickly as possible to her corbicula on the back. So it comes off her body. Okay.
And she packs it wet, and there it is in those solid little pellets on her legs.
Gotcha.
And then my other picture is this blue orchard bee, and you can't even see all the anthers and the stigma on the flower because her body is all over it. And she's wiggling around all over it, and she's collecting the pollen on her belly with all her hairs, and it's dry and it's falling off all over the place. And so, it's getting transferred all over the place. So, there are 2 different foraging behaviors that may be helping in this system. And then a very wonderful person who has studied synergisms between wild bees and honeybees, Claire Kremen, once gave a talk where I was an attendee. And she talked about that the interaction may be that the methodical nature of a honeybee going from flower to flower to flower on the same plant or the same tree may be picking up some of this loose, crazy pollen that's left behind by like a blue orchard bee that's collecting this pollen dry, dropping it everywhere, making a big mess, going all over the tree, different trees and zooming around. But that honeybee kind of picks it up and gets it on her body hairs and methodically delivers that extra variety of pollen around on that same tree. And so there does a very systematic delivery of the non-varietal, that you need two varieties for pollinating almonds and cherries. So you want from one row of trees to cross over to the other row of trees. And that's what a blue orchard bee also does.
So she hypothesized that because the blue orchard bee is kind of like dropping pollen all over the place from different cultivars, it's just kind of falling off, that when a honeybee then goes in its kind of, regimented way of moving, each of its visits picking up a little bit of that compatible pollen. And so her visits are kind of like better than they would have been on their own.
And then delivering it within one tree instead of pinging around like the way the orchard bees do it. So together they're doing like this cool job as opposed to just each one doing their own thing.
Okay, well that sounds like a really good system. Then you kind of like you're building on the strengths of both species and putting together into one pollination system.
Right, because the other theory was that say a solitary bee is visiting a flower and a honeybee comes along and it pisses off the solitary bee who flies off and it gets it to move around more, or the honeybee, the vice versa. So, but you don't really see that often. You hardly ever see the blue orchard bees in the orchards. You see a lot of honeybees, but not the orchard bees. And so it's like, well, where are they? What are they doing? But they're out there doing a lot. It's just you don't see them because they kind of zoom around quickly. They just don't stay in one place long for your eye to catch up with them.
Interesting. Well, that's a good. I've often heard that, and I've wondered how to explain that to a grower. Is like you've bought these bees, but you won't see them. And I wasn't sure how to explain that.
Yeah, well, the other thing is if you've got a hive of honeybees out and the equivalent per where we've come up with for management is 400 female orchard bees. You've got potentially 10,000 female honeybee foragers versus 400 female orchard bees out there.
By virtue of numbers, you're always going to see honeybees. Yeah.
Yeah, but they may be, some are only collecting nectar, some are only collecting pollen, where the orchard bee is collecting both. But zooming around, for whatever reason, she kind of moves around a lot more. It's just her behavior.
Well, I was thinking that this 2B thing, I was familiar with it when I was working with Dr. Shelley Hoover in Lethbridge, Alberta, where there the hybrid canola seed production always uses 2Bs. The seed industries there always use honeybees and they use leaf cutting bees. And the idea would be something along the same line. That's a compatibility issue that the honeybees you have to move pollen from one bay of plants to another bay spatially, and that the honeybees tend to go up and down the rows.
Right. They're little automatrons. They're just very specific to just going, I'm going to go in this direction until I run out, as opposed to just exploring everywhere.
Okay, so this is where we're looking right now with the blue orchard bees in the West. This is kind of the model that's starting to emerge. And I think the other thing I heard when you were talking is that this is recent. Like this is not something that's been going on for 50 years like alfalfa leaf cutting bees. This is the last decade or so, or 20 years. And so, but we're seeing that people have some honeybees. Do people typically take the rate of their honeybees down, or do they keep what the kind of practice are you seeing out there?
Well, so I'm hearing about the practices. I don't get to do the practices. We did have a couple years where in doing some research, a collaborator allowed us to add orchard bees into places where they put half their stocking rate of honeybees. So we had that very situation, and we saw that the yield was equivalent to other years that they had. And I think that gave entrepreneurs who are trying to be bee suppliers and pollination specialists, using the orchard bees, they have taken that model. And we actually got the information from someone else as well. So we just tested it. And then, so people have gone with that with the kind of the backing of science to say, yeah, this should work. And it keeps working. So that's, I think, where what I hear is where we're at. And we're starting to get some testimony from real users and people who are making it practical for their systems and trying to transfer over to that kind of system. It reminds me a lot of alternative fuels. It's taken a while for people to make a decision that they want to change and invest the money in it. And the early investors have to pay a lot more than people who get at it later when the prices come down, when it gets all figured out and when all the bugs are worked out. So there's the early adopters and then the people who can benefit from all of that as becomes affordable for more people and more mainstream and more testimony that it's worth having, and it works just as well. A lot of people, I got a hybrid car and they're like, yeah, I bet you can't go up a hill. It's like, of course I can. Better than your car. You can't tell the difference, except that I pay, I forget to go get gas because I do it so seldom, But it just kind of reminds me of that. It's a change in attitude and, and how you go about things. And also having people that you can't just call up and say, hey, honeybee keeper, come and do your thing, drop off some hives and feed them if they need it. It takes a different level of management and a different type of management to do orchard bees. Honeybees are the extreme different bee. It's not like, which is always kind of funny. It's all the other bees are the same, more the same than anything is like the honeybees. And so the honeybees are the weird one. But it is because it's transportable and lives in this man-made house, the hive that we give it. It makes it a unique bee that it's amenable to, moving around as a pollinator. For the orchard bee and the leaf cutting bee, you can't just move them around like that. You can place them in a place so that they will pollinate, but you're kind of one and done. You can't take that and do the next crop or truck them out somewhere else because they're done. And you can have a different stock that you hold back and use a little bit later. But so it's just a different mindset of how to do it. We do have a project where we're trying to overlap the two, where you can emerge orchard bees off of the top of a honeybee hive. There's a patented device that's available for doing that. We're field testing it right now. But one of the challenges would be, will a honeybee keeper let you mess around with their hives? And when you release the bees, are they in a being co-located with the honeybees? Will they still go out and visit all of the orchard? Or will they want to stay close by? Or where would they go?
The idea would be that on top of the honeybee colony, it's warm. And so,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because otherwise, when you manage the orchard bees, you have to, even though they overwinter as adults in the early spring, like in February when almonds bloom, you have to heat them up artificially to get them to chew out of their cocoons and then fly out. And if you just put them out in the orchard, kind of like ready to chew out, they'll still take forever to chew out, and bloom will be gone by the time they all get out, and you'll kind of waste them. So if they, it's almost 100 degrees on a honeybee hive, and we've recorded the temperatures inside with the in this little box that's a false top on a honeybee hive, and they do great. They come out really fast. Within 3 days, all your orchard bees are already hatched out and out in the open, and
I'll be darned.
So it's kind of fun. But we're going to field test it in Washington this year.
Well, I suppose the last thing I just wanted to mention or kind of explore with you a little bit is that I guess the fact that honeybees can be trucked around also kind of you have to have a real good partnership with your beekeeper, because delivery can be challenging. I mean, I was thinking in situations where you have a cool spring in almonds. In the Pacific Northwest, it heats up. You can have a situation where the bees aren't quite done in almonds, but they need to be in cherries pronto. And that with these other bees, they're yours, and you can start them up when you want to start them up.
Yeah. Yeah. You can, once you get them into cold storage, which happens in the fall, the orchard bees and the leaf cutting bees, you can bring them out of cold storage when you're ready for them. So you could use some of them that you overwintered in almonds, and you could use a different batch of them that you incubate later for cherries, or even into some caneberry crops. And so then you have the leaf cutting bees that can be used for canola and for alfalfa, and they forage for about 11 weeks. Some of those do. And even in the leaf cutters, they will go through different generations in the summer in some hotter areas. And so that's got a whole nother meaning towards it. I've never really gotten to see that because that happens like in Southern California. But that's another strategy that can be used. But once then they're into winter management, you can hold them quite a long time beyond what you could like honeybee hives because they're always active. And once they get active, they're gonna have to find food and eat.
Super. Wow. Well, let's take a quick break. We'll come back. I want to explore, I love that metaphor you have of like alternative fuels. It's like, what are the challenges to the alternative fuels of, crop pollination in the West, realizing themselves? So let's take a break and we'll come back and explore that. Okay, we're back. So, I want to think about this question of like, what are some of these obstacles to people using solitary bees in Western crop production at a higher level? Do you think there's some, like one of the things that comes to mind is, are there some crops that you think are really good fit for solitary bees that we're just not even thinking or using them? Or, so what are the obstacles? What's holding us back?
Yeah, well, or a little bit back to that attitude question. So it's like, having to try a new thing and not knowing if you have all the parts and pieces, kind of like starting a new project. I started during this COVID stay-at-home stuff. I started doing some artwork, and I was like, I don't know if I could do it. And I don't know if I have all the tools to do it. And so I've had to challenge myself to go out and buy a few things to make an investment in some things that I didn't already have, and to go online and read about it and learn about it, and to kind of take a chance and not even know if I was good at it. Maybe I'm not a, good artist at all. And so I figured out a lot of things for myself, and now I'm happy with where I'm at, and I could go a lot further. So with the orchard bee stuff or with the leaf cutting bee stuff, it's a whole different set of equipment. You have to have a whole different tool set compared to the honeybees. And there's not a lot of people around who know exactly how to do it. And for the leaf cutting bee, there's more information there. If you live in the West and you have almost a family tradition of doing it, because you have to have some specialized equipment that you can't just go to Home Depot and pick up. You can't. It's not just there. They're specially made bee blocks and puncher outers or scraper outers, or I don't even know if they have real names. And then you have to have big coolers to store things in, the bees in, and incubators to heat them up in, and then transfer them out. And there's not many companies that will come and do that for you. Actually, there's probably only like 2 or 3 that will do it for you. And it's the same with the orchard bees. And they each have their own sensitivity about how to figure out their timing, partly because of how they overwinter. And so, and then also on the crops you put them on, some crops go fast and some crops have a lot of flowering for over a longer period of time. So it's really important how you're able to manage them. So it sounds really nuanced and a lot scary, like there's a lot of things you could mess up. But then you also only have to be scared about it and worried about them for a short period of time versus honeybees that have to be managed the whole year round. And then have to be split, and you have to worry about the queen, whereas within the solitary bees, every female is her own queen and worker. She does everything herself. So it's a whole different mindset about how to work with them, and also not be afraid of them. They don't really sting such that you have a bad reaction, and so it's hard to get stung. You don't get attacked or swarmed. So I think it's about being educated what to do with them, and knowing that they will work for you. And so that's where it takes researchers like myself and educators like yourself who can kind of break down the science to the persons, who want to use it, and then ask all the right questions. But it also takes the curious user. Reminds me of some Malcolm Gladwell stuff, like having people, hit a tipping point, and people who adopt it and people who like to talk about it, and then the people who eventually become the mainstream users.
Well, I was thinking about, with leaf cutting bees that you at the beginning of the section, you talked about how there was intensive research, took years of development, and, now it's pretty ubiquitous. And there's, like you point out, we've gone through this period of where honeybees have had a lot of difficulty, but, the supply chain production chain is so resilient that there's just a lot of supply out there. And I guess mason bees being newer, is it useful to think about like this timeline with leaf cutting bees as the kind of, this is, in a couple of years it'll automate, or is it really, it's so different a system that, making parallels to leaf cutting bees is a little misleading?
Yes, I think both things. The big difference is that the leaf cutting bee is not a native species that we, in a sense, care about. If we destroy the leaf cutting bees, we've just destroyed, this is terrible to say in a way, we've just destroyed an exotic species that was never intended to be here in the first place. Alfalfa is exotic as well. Mm-hmm. But when we lose the orchard bees, we could wipe out or cause epidemics in a native species that could spread from commercialism back into the native environment, sort of what's happened with our native bumblebees. And so that's a different kind of worry that I personally have. I don't want to see that happen. But also there's an interesting thing about like being a native species and a non-native species. I think when exotic species come and they are able to adapt to very highly disturbed environments, they have some sort of characteristics that make it stick. Not all organisms that get moved to a new place get established, but some do. So what are those characteristics that make them so amenable to that? They're kind of trashy species, the fire ants and other bugs. And so they just can kind of deal with the human environment. And I think the orchard bees have a little of that, like more nativism, to where they're not so amenable to being manipulated. They're not a trashy species in that sense, that they are disturbed by us handling them and moving them around in ways that I don't think the leafcutter bees are. And in my own research, I've seen that you can, by the odor cues that the bees use, the orchard bees are much more particular and can be much more disturbed if you mess around with where their nest holes are, or if you kind of take away their odors, they'll get so confused when they come home to their nest if it's been messed with that they might leave. Or like when fungicides are sprayed and they kind of get this malodor or something going on with them, they'll leave. Whereas leaf cutting bees will something kind of weird went on here, but oh yeah, whatever. I guess I'll just come on back and do this. I'll just pick a new hole. They're just, kind of like dogs and cats. Like the puppies are like happy to see you most of the time, and the cats are like maybe not. So I think those nuances are going to make it a little harder for the orchard bee to work out so well. And they also are more keen to disperse from a release site compared to the leaf cutting bees. One other thing I'll say, we put out, say, 1,000 bees per acre. So that's 400 females and then a bunch of males. So 1,000 bees per acre when we're working with blue orchard bees. We're working with leaf cutting bees. They put out 40 to 60,000 bees per acre. That's a gazillion bees. Mm-hmm. And they really just flood the landscape with them. And they want a lot of seed production. There's a lot of little tiny flowers out there for alfalfa seed production and canola too. But in my own research, I found that a lot of those bees don't stick around either, but you don't realize it because the supply and the numbers you start with are so great. And the way that they are so happy to nest in these huts with a gazillion little bee holes, and they can find their own nest and use whatever holes. They're just so much easier to deal with in that regard. Where blue orchard bees, they don't like to be that. They don't like the big city. They like to spread out and be in the country and have their own little nooks.
I remember that with leaf cutting bees, they're almost every hole is plugged and it's kind of reliably. Yeah. I remember growers would come in and they would replace the blocks halfway in, and they could maybe fill another block up. I was like, that's amazing. Yeah.
You don't have that problem, air quotes, problem in orchard bees. You don't really fill up blocks so much. You can, because I don't think they like to. I think a lot of those holes are made by the same females. They kind of like to spread out a little. And so they're not that kind of aggregating species in the same way that leaf cutting bees are. There is another bee that's been introduced, another mason bee that's introduced into the U.S. for crop pollination. It was intentional, Osmia cornifrons. And I think it has that kind of trashy personality in that I think it might do a little better. because it's okay with all that disturbance.
Okay, so we've got there is this time factor of working the kinks out, which is going to take some time, and the automation and bringing the price down. But there is also the fact that this species, the blue orchard bee, is a native species, and maybe it's just going to be a little harder to kind of like get to the same level of, output and drop the price and supply as it has been for leaf cutting bees.
Yeah, that's my general feeling, although I'm still super hopeful. I mean, I'm not naysaying whatsoever. I still think it's a great bee and a great complement to honeybees. I just don't think it's not a direct comparison to the leaf cutting bees. The other thing is that the mechanistic way of the way they punch out they punch the leaf cutting bees out of their nesting holes with machines, because the cocoon is kind of hard. There's a larva inside, and then that cocoon is wrapped in a lot of leaf pieces. And then the orchard bee is this soft cocoon with no outside wrapping, and it's an adult inside that if you damage it, it's not going to fly for you later. And so you can't just punch them out the same way. You can't mishandle them in the same way. So that's another little nuance that makes them extra special.
Well, all of those things in mind, it has been remarkable. In the short period I've been working with these bees, just to see the price drop. There has been a lot more supply. It's kind of remarkable, the amount of supply that's come online over the last 5 years even. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I feel like we've kind of, hit, it's been a steady climb, my years of working with this bee, which is close to, I would say 15 to 20 years. And I think we're over the hump, and it's downhill from here, but it's not a steep downhill. It's a gradual downhill.
Well, one last thing I wanted to ask you about is you're going to be speaking at a webinar this week. This episode is going to come out on Sunday. We're recording the week before, but the Pollinator Report. What are you going to be talking about at this event? And we'll plug it at the beginning, but what will people catch?
I'm going to show some beautiful pictures of these bees. I'm going to talk about why these two bees are important in agriculture, what kind of foods that you get because they are at our disposal. I'll talk a little bit about how they are not like honeybees. I'll explain a lot more about their biology, and also like maybe what you can do to have them at your own home, and how to safeguard them against, management practices, ruining habitat or use of pesticides. So it's a very general and public talk, hopefully engaging. And so I'm really happy to be doing it. I'm pretty excited. The person who has asked me to do this, Justina Block, is her company sells Osmia bees, and she has been spearheading a series of talks. So the other talks that are available are a lot about bee diversity. And so I'm hoping that my talk will dovetail into there's all this great diversity of bees. We only think of bumblebees and honeybees when people bring up the subject of bees. And so to connect these two other bees that I study to our food supply is pretty exciting for me to get to do.
Well, I'm sure I love your talks. They're always so great. There's always some detail there. It's just you really know these bees inside out, and the pictures are always wonderful. So I would really, if you've had a taste of it this episode, head over. We'll have it in the show notes. It'll be in the show notes showing you how to register. So, but let's take a quick break. We have one last segment we do. I'm really curious what your answers are going to be. So we'll be back in just a second. Okay, we are back. So we were just talking at the break. Great answers. So let's start them off. Do you have a pollinator book recommendation?
Yes. Can I give two?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Because I have never managed my own honeybees, and I'm not a honeybee person, there's two kind of honeybee books that I really like that I would recommend. And one is Honeybee Democracy by Tom Seeley. And it is about why bees swarm and then kind of the swarm mentality and how they work together. I like to be introspective, and it has that kind of feel for it. It's very sciencey, but yet it kind of brings it to like, it has that human, that anthropomorphic kind of connection to it. And I was just really enthralled in the book. It was a great read for somebody who doesn't know a lot about honeybees, and I've learned tons, and it wasn't overly scientific. My other one is The Beekeeper's Lament. I forget the author of that book. Have you read that one?
I have not. I'm going to look it up as we're talking here.
It's 2010, and a great friend of mine recommended it to me. And it is a journalist who goes out with this crazy beekeeper guy, honeybee keeper guy from Blackfoot, Idaho, and he drives a Corvette, and he has these wonky emails he sends to her. He's really an interesting character, and he's kind of like, he's just hard for her to interview, which makes it interesting. But he's also talks about how his relatives started the movement of honeybees by train out to almonds from my hometown here in Logan, Utah.
Really?
And I didn't know that was going to be in there. And then it was all these almond board people that I have met over the years are all mentioned in there, including Justin Schmidt, whose book is The Sting of the Wild. And I've known Justin for years. He studied bees his whole life. So anyway, it's got a lot of great characters in it, and the book itself is told really well. And you learn a lot about just the honeybee industry. And so I enjoyed that tremendously.
Well, we'll put a link in the show notes. Hannah Nordhaus, I see, is the author. The one thing I do, I remember, I'm old enough to remember this, is that there was a time when it was hard to rent honeybees for pollination, that there was a lot of investment and time to convince growers to even use honeybees. Now we look back at it and it's kind of like, oh, of course they would. But, it took, years of research and like the McGregor book and really to kind of make the case to growers that this was useful.
Yeah, there's so much we take for granted in there.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, the next question I have for you, I'm really excited to ask you is because I know I always love going through your papers because you've got so many great little gadgets that you've discovered. Like, wow, she did that with that. That's so cool. So I got. We haven't published the one where we use hair curlers, but yeah, okay. What? You see, I'm not even surprised. Like usually somebody else said that, I'd be like, huh, hair curlers? What? I was like, of course she would. Well, but are hair curlers your go-to tools?
You can use a big hair curler like a boll weevil trap to emerge bees in and collect them. So organza bags, hair curler, and the funnel like a boll weevil trap.
I have to say the one thing I've learned because we've been emerging bees out of trap nests is you need really thick material because all these megachilidae can chew through anything.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We have bees all over the lab.
Anyways, it's not the hair curler that is your go-to tool. Tell us what you've got.
Okay, so we love the otoscope, and I didn't come up with this. It was a tool being used by the bee lab people for years, but it's the thing that the doctor looks down your ear or up your nose in, and we take off like the special tips on the end, but they're great for looking down into the cavities of these bees. You can see all the way to the back. You can see eggs and plugs and pollen and all that stuff in there. And so we have a whole bunch of these rechargeable otoscopes in the lab. But the other tool that I really love are hemostats, which doctors use to clamp off your veins or during surgery.
Oh yeah.
And without the little locking mechanism, we cut those off. You can just kind of slip your fingers in there and then grab the paper straws that we use as inserts into the bee board, so we can pull out paper straws that have bee nests in them, just kind of efficiently and rapidly. They're just like the perfect tool for that. And so I love an otoscope and hemostats. They're in all my bags.
Well, I have to say, I remember emailing you years ago about the otoscope to get the model and everything. And the thing I really loved about it is you can get the number of females that are nested. If you go there at night, then you can see you can actually get a count of how many females actually are starting a nest.
Yeah, right. So you use your hemostats to pull out the paper straw, and then you hold the paper straw with the otoscope backlighting the whole thing, and then you can mark on the nest how far along it's progressed, put it back in, and then, over time, you will know exactly which were made per day. You just date on the straw with your pencil, because you can backlight all of that too, instead of just look down the inside.
So amazing. Whoa. I want to try that this year. Okay. The last question I have for you is, you've talked about 2 species here today, and maybe this is not even your favorite species, but do you have a species of pollinator when you see it, you're just like, oh, I love that critter?
Yeah. I was thinking about it really has to be, one of the two bees that I do study. But I think because it was the reason for my job and I fell in love with it first. There's something always about your first is that I have to love the Megachile rotundata, my alfalfa leaf cutting bee. I just really love that little bee and its wiggly behavior, and it's not I love its attitude. It's just so happy-go-lucky. And so I just, and some of the pictures I have of it just make me happy to see. I've got this great picture of the bee had just landed on an alfalfa flower and tripped it. And this pollen is just bursting from behind the bee. It's just exploding. And I just, that it just brings me happiness. So I love that little bee.
I always think of them as little tanks. They just seem like up for anything. It's like, yeah, we're going.
Yeah. Well, I'm a rugby player. I love tough and I love teamwork and I love just get out there and do it.
Man, well, that's awesome. Well, you were just telling me that you coached I was surprised as one of the Pitts-Singer things I didn't know about. You coached the university rugby team.
Yeah, Utah State University Women's Rugby Club. Yeah, I'm their coach. I love them to death. Yeah, we don't sing dirty rugby songs, just in case you're wondering. I know them, but I don't teach them. I just teach them all the good rucks, balls, and tackles.
Oh, that's
good scrums.
Amazing. I'm so amazed. It's just another level of appreciation for all that you do.
Yeah. Be careful. I tackle.
Well, thank you so much. It was great catching up with you, and good luck with your talk later this week.
Hey, thanks so much. This was fun.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn, Sin, and Neil, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollination.podcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.